This is not a story about incompetence. It is not about a failed strategy or a general who made a mistake. This is a story of an order, a deliberate, calculated order given to an American colonel instructing him to stand down and let his men be slaughtered. The file is dated December 1944. The title on the folder is classified. The question it answers is one of the darkest of the entire European conflict. Why would a command, in a moment of absolute crisis, order a decorated officer to let his men die? You have 10 seconds to decide if you want to know the answer. Because the truth buried in this file is not about sacrifice, it's about a secret. A secret so powerful, High Command believed it was worth more than the lives of an entire battalion. Welcome to the Apocryphal Archive. Open File 044, The Mallory Dilemma. Our story begins in the coldest winter of the Second World War, December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest. This is the dawn of the Battle of the Bulge, and the American line, stretched thin and exhausted, is about to break. The German offensive has achieved total surprise. They are pouring through the forest in a massive armored thrust, and the men on the front line are in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. In a cramped, frozen fire control shelter dug into the earth behind Battery B of the 23rd Field Artillery, Colonel Richard Mallory listened to the radio, and the sound was one of pure chaos. Voices overlapped, crackling with static and fear. "God, they're everywhere, breaking through the wire. Zero visibility, we can't see them. Forward elements are gone. I repeat, Sierra 1 is gone." Mallory was 41 years old. He was born in a railsyard family in Ohio, a man who understood the geometry of heavy iron and the smell of coal and diesel before he ever understood tactical maps. He was a practical man, a mathematician who had excelled at Staff College, but he never lost the practical muscle memory of the rail yard. He was an artilleryman who trusted calculations but hated waste. He had served in North Africa, watched a supply convoy burn under a Stuka attack. He had served in Italy, where miscalculated fire missions had cost the lives of his own men. The loss of his younger brother, Joseph, in Sicily had hardened him into a leader who despised unnecessary sacrifice. In his jacket pocket was a letter from his wife, Hazel, that had arrived 2 days prior. "My dearest," it began. "The snow has started to fall here, and it makes me think of you. Patty asked if you would be home to build a snowman." Mallory had slept badly for months, waking with plans to reduce the cost in men by any legal means. But his orders, the very reason he was in this specific sector of the Ardennes, were the opposite of legal. In fact, they were entirely illegal. You see, Colonel Mallory was not a standard artillery officer. He and the men in the foxholes in front of him were part of one of the war's greatest secrets. They were attached to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. We know them today as the Ghost Army. This is the first layer of the file, the first reason he was ordered to let his men die. His entire purpose on that ridge was to be bait. The Ghost Army was a phantom unit, a traveling roadshow of deception. They possessed inflatable tanks, massive speakers that blared the sounds of armored divisions on the move, and a special effects team that could simulate the flash of artillery. Their job was to draw German divisions away from the real fight. They were, by design, a target. They were masters of visual, sonic, and atmospheric deception. Mallory's unit was a hybrid. They had real guns, but they were supplemented by the sonic trickery of the 23rd. His orders from Theater Command, delivered by a grim-faced General Miles just a week before, were explicit. "Colonel," Miles had said, his breath fogging in the tent, "your job is not to win. Your job is to be seen. You will hold that ridge, and you will make so much noise that the entire German 12th SS Panzer Division thinks you are the 7th Armored. You are the anvil. You will make them commit. You are bait. Do you understand your orders?"
To be bait means to be vulnerable. To be bait means to invite an attack you cannot possibly hope to win. The order was, in effect, you must appear weak, draw them in, and die, so that the real force can strike elsewhere. This is the central, brutal paradox of the Ghost Army. They were tasked with saving lives by putting their own in a position of certain death. And now, at 0530 on December 16th, the deception had worked too well. The Germans had taken the bait. But the force they sent was not a probe. It was an avalanche. Waves of enemy infantry, supported by armor, were closing along the wooded ridge. The ghosts were about to become real ghosts. The radio calls were no longer deception, they were real screams. Battery B, this is Forward Observer 1. They're in the trees. Oh God! The radio went dead with a burst of static. Mallory's battery commander, Captain Alan Pierce, a man who lived by the book, looked at Mallory, his face pale. "Colonel, the deception is over. They know we're here. We have to call for fire support from Division." Mallory shook his head. "Division is miles away. They won't get here in time, and our orders are to hold and maintain the Phantom." "Sir, they aren't Phantom," hissed Sergeant Daniel Ortiz, who ran the tube racks. "My men in those foxholes are real. I have seen bullets chew this earth, and I am not ready to see
My boys die because of some game. This is the moment, the pivot, the instant that this file 044, was created. Because Mallory's unit had a second secret, a secret within the secret. It had arrived 3 days earlier under the cover of night in a small convoy of unmarked trucks. It was a shipment that should have gone to the 9th Army's Anti-Aircraft Division, but it was routed to Mallory by a quartermaster who owed him a favor. It was a small crate stenciled with a simple code, Project T13, red band. Inside was the device that could end the attack, the device that could save his men, and the device that High Command, in a memo marked Eyes Only, had strictly, absolutely forbidden from ever being used on land. This is the second and most important reason why Colonel Mallory was ordered to let his men die. He was holding the most valuable secret of the war, and Command was more afraid of losing the secret than they were of losing his men. The secret was called the proximity fuse. To understand the gravity of this moment, you must first understand the problem that had plagued Allied forces since 1940. The problem was simple. Artillery was shockingly inaccurate. In the early years of the conflict, anti-aircraft and counter-battery work was a game of luck. Fuses detonated on impact, a direct hit, which was nearly impossible, or after a time delay. Against a fast-moving aircraft or dispersed ground troops, this meant thousands of shells passed harmlessly above or beside their marks. For the Navy, this was catastrophic. In 1942 and 1943, the loss rate of ships and crews to air attack was intolerable. A single bomber could survive multiple barrages because timed fuses were useless over uncertain ranges. Statistics from naval reports showed the number of shells needed to produce one hit was staggeringly high. In the Atlantic, a convoy escort could expend thousands of projectiles to shoot down one bomber. Military planners demanded a solution, a smart shell. A shell that could detect its target and detonate at the precise optimal point in space to maximize the lethal spread of its fragments. The technical challenge seemed impossible. Electronics of the time were fragile. They were built on glass vacuum tubes, delicate filaments, and batteries that drained. The acceleration out of a gun barrel produced forces measured in thousands of Gs. The spin rates could exceed 20,000 revolutions per minute. The shock from the muzzle exit was like a hammer blow. No one in 1940 believed a radio-based sensor could survive being fired from an artillery piece. The glass envelopes of the tubes would shatter. The contact leads would rip from their mounts. The batteries would be crushed into paste. But the need was absolute.
This is where the Apocryphal Archive opens its deepest drawer. The story of the fuse is a story of hidden genius. In 1940, the Tizard mission brought British advances to American labs. The
Navy and Army created dedicated secret sections. Section T and the newly formed Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, became the hubs where physicists, engineers, and ordnance officers met. The names in this file are not famous, but they should be. Dr. Alan Whitaker, a physicist at APL, led the vacuum tube redesign. In a small, humid lab along the Chesapeake, he argued late into the night with Captain Thomas Reed of the Ordnance Department. "We can make a tube that will take the shock," Whitaker said, tapping a diagram. "But not if it's made like the ones on the shelf. The glass has to be thicker, tapered. The filaments need flexible leads." Reed rubbed his jaw. "If it works at sea, it could save ships. The brass will never approve experimental gear without tests." "That's why we will do the tests and show them," Reed said. "We have to be ready to scale," Whitaker pressed. "We will need factories and secrecy. And a way to make the battery safe until firing," Whitaker added. This is the kind of hidden lore that changes the world. They had to invent shock-isolated mounts, using nested metal sleeves and powder damping materials to absorb the initial impulse. They had to invent entirely new batteries with inertia-activated switches, batteries that remained inert until the shell experienced the characteristic acceleration signature of firing. A key breakthrough came from a materials engineer named Margaret Hayes. She proposed a specific borosilicate glass composition that resisted microcracking. At the General Electric factory, a production engineer named Robert Green redesigned the assembly jig to reduce handling stress. The entire system was a miracle of engineering. A small transmitter and receiver tuned to a frequency that reflected off a target, a simple decision circuit, and the inertia battery. The device remained electrically isolated. When fired, the acceleration closed the switch, activated the battery. The transmitter sent pulses. The receiver listened. When the echo pattern matched a target at a lethal distance, the detonator received a trigger. All of this happened in fractions of a second, in a space the size of a fist. The early prototypes passed their trials. Test barrels at the Naval Proximity Ground launched shells into the sky. When commanders saw the films of drone targets being shredded by near misses, clouds of flak appearing exactly where the plane was, there was no longer room for disbelief. Scaling production required paranoid secrecy. Contracts were split. Companies like RCA and General Electric manufactured vacuum tubes under cover names. Workers assembled parts in windowless rooms without knowing the final application. Shipments moved in unmarked crates, escorted by military couriers. The cost per unit was astronomical, but acceptable. In a meeting with Admiral Charles Barton, Robert Greene argued for expansion. "If you give us more time, we can double output," Greene said. Barton exhaled. "That's not my question. My question is, can we ensure none of this leaves the docks incorrectly marked?" "Yes," Greene said. "We will open a new lane, clear shipments directly under convoy security. And the factories," Barton added, "they will work in shifts, in sealed rooms." Greene agreed. "No one will know the full picture." Early combat use at sea proved the concept. It was a war winner. Convoy escorts reported flak effectiveness improved dramatically. The number of rounds fired per kill dropped by an order of magnitude. The fuse was adapted to defend London against V-1 flying bombs, where proximity mattered more than direct impact. But this brings us to the dilemma, the one unbreakable rule. The doctrine that kept the device off land was rooted in one single paralyzing fear: capture. If an unexploded proximity fuse, a dud, fell into enemy hands, they could reverse engineer it. They could copy it. They could develop countermeasures. The technological advantage that was saving thousands of lives at sea would be gone. The order was absolute.
The proximity fuse is not, under any circumstances, to be deployed ashore. This was the order that Colonel Mallory was staring at. This was the why. High Command was not ordering him to let his men die. They were ordering him to protect the secret. The fact that protecting the secret meant his men would die was simply the cost of that secrecy. It was a cold, brutal calculation. The archive is full of these calculations. And this is the moment to ask yourself the question that has defined this channel. If you value this kind of deep research, this hidden history where engineering and human judgment collide, you need to subscribe. This is what we do. We open the files that were meant to stay closed. Hit that button and join the archive. Now, back to the bunker. 0545. The German mortar fire was walking closer. The ground shook. Mallory could hear the distinct, ripping sound of an MG-42 opening up. "Sir," Captain Pierce yelled over the noise. "The line is pierced at Point Alpha. The Germans are on the ridge. They're rolling up the flank. The Ghost unit is exposed." Sergeant Ortiz grabbed Mallory's arm. "Colonel, my men are being slaughtered. We have real guns. We have to use them." "If we use standard-timed fuses, we'll be lucky to hit anything," Mallory said, his voice flat. "It's just noise. It won't stop them." "Then use the red bands," Ortiz said, his voice dropping. Captain Pierce looked horrified. "Sergeant, you are out of line." "Colonel, those are marked not for land. That is a direct order from Theater Command. Using them risks the entire naval strategy. It risks the V-1 defense." "The V-1s aren't in this foxhole, Captain," Ortiz roared. "The men at sea are not here. My men are. Right now." This was the dilemma. This was the impossible choice. Mallory, the man who hated waste, was being forced to waste the lives of his men to protect a secret. The man whose brother died in Sicily was being asked to sacrifice more men for a rule. He looked at the fuses.
He looked at the map. He looked at the terror in Captain Pierce's eyes and the fury in Sergeant Ortiz's. He thought of the rail yard in Ohio, the geometry of heavy iron. He thought of his wife's letter, "Come home safe." He thought of his daughter Patty and the snowman, and he made the decision. He picked up the field phone to the gun pits. "Colonel, what are you doing?" Pierce asked, his voice a whisper. Mallory didn't look at him. He spoke into the receiver. "Fire control to all tubes. Load the red band projectiles into tubes 1 through 8. Repeat, load red band projectiles. Fire mission to follow." Pierce was white. "Colonel, those are marked not for land. I must protest this order." Mallory finally turned to him, his eyes like cold iron. "We either break rules or we break men, Captain. Your protest is noted." Ortiz grabbed his own phone. "Gun pits, this is Sergeant Ortiz. You heard the Colonel. We will secure any unexploded components and document serial numbers. We keep this tight." Lieutenant Frank Hammond, who scheduled the barrages, chimed in. "We will keep a tight perimeter. We recover what we can." Pierce, defeated, picked up his own handset. "I will execute your order, sir." He added, so quietly only Mallory could hear him, "God help us." The barrage that followed was short, terrible, and unlike anything ever seen in land warfare. The guns roared. The shells arced into the pre-dawn darkness. And then the sky erupted. The proximity fuses worked perfectly. Instead of exploding on impact with the ground, where trenches and foxholes would offer protection, they detonated at the optimal height above the trees. A rain of superheated steel and fragmentation, thousands of fragments per shell, shredded the forest canopy. The German advance hit a curtain of death. Trench lines that had been considered safe were suddenly lethally exposed. Prisoners later described their bewilderment.
They thought they were under a massive, coordinated air attack. They heard no planes, only the sound of shells singing in the air, followed by explosions above them. The tangible effect was immediate. The assault collapsed. The momentum of the 12th SS in that sector folded like paper. After-action reports, which were immediately classified, tallied approximately 700 enemy killed in that single engagement as a direct consequence of the proximity-fused shell pattern. Private Samuel Green, a 19-year-old from the 23rd, was in a forward listening post. He felt the first airburst like a thunderclap above his head. Dirt and pine needles came down in a rain, and the hot taste of metal filled his mouth. He heard men shouting in German, and then they were silent. He saw silhouettes in the trees rise to attack, and then simply disintegrate in the smoke. He would later write to his family, a letter that was heavily censored. "We were in a bad spot. We thought it was the end, and then the sky just opened up. I don't know what."
It was. But it was a miracle. I later could not be certain if what I had seen had been salvation or slaughter. I will carry that doubt for the rest of my life. The battle was won. The secret was out. The proprietary process for field recovery began immediately. Teams under Sergeant Ortiz's command moved out at first light, collecting unexploded units, marking and logging serials, and isolating them in guarded containers. Technicians disassembled the duds and burned the subassemblies to prevent reverse engineering. As word of the field use spread through official channels, the debate was fierce. Some commanders lauded Mallory for saving his unit. Others, particularly in the Navy, were furious, fearing what the unauthorized use meant for secrecy. A memo, which we have in this file, flew from High Command to Admiral Barton. The Ardennes incident cannot be repeated. Operational necessity may compel selective use, but policy must preserve strategic secrecy. Barton, in a tense conference in a command tent, slammed his fist on the table. This saved lives at sea, and it just saved a brigade ashore. "We cannot risk proliferation if one falls intact," a lawyer argued. It was Dr. Alan Whitaker, the physicist, flown in on an emergency transport, who provided the answer. He had received a terse telegram about the land deployment. In his notebook, he had written a single line: "If exposure is inevitable, then make sure the parts are useless to reverse engineering." He looked at the generals. "We designed them to be tamper-proof," he said. "We designed tamper-proof seals and encoded serial stamps. And we made the glass fragile after impact. They can't copy what they can't recover intact. The secret is probably safe." So we return to the central question. Why was Colonel Mallory ordered to let his men die? Because High Command had made a choice. The Ghost Army was expendable. The secret of the fuse was not. They were willing to sacrifice a pawn to protect the Queen. The order was a cold calculation that the value of the technology outweighed the value of the men. Colonel Mallory made a different calculation. After the war, the trajectories of these figures diverged. Colonel Mallory was never publicly court-martialed. He received a private reprimand for disobeying a direct order, and an informal commendation from peers who believed his choice saved the line. He returned home to Ohio with a letter from a corporal whose life he saved, and he finally built that snowman with his daughter. Dr. Alan Whitaker continued his career in electronics, becoming a pioneer in peacetime radar. Margaret Hayes moved to industrial ceramics, writing papers on shock-resistant materials that influenced civilian aerospace. Robert Greene oversaw production lines that made everything from radio tubes to medical equipment. The fuse itself went from a guarded secret to a standard item. Production scaled into the millions. It is credited with saving thousands of lives at sea and on land. But the legacy remains complex. The post-engagement investigation confirmed the 700 enemy killed. It also confirmed that Mallory's decision, that single act of defiance, forced a change in doctrine. The Army formalized a restricted authorization for land use. The file closes with a single reflection: a small transmitter, a receiver, an inertia-locked battery, and a detonator. A compact assembly of ideas that survived the impossible and altered how war was fought. But this technical success brought a moral cost. The same device that saved convoys and artillerymen created new, terrifying fates for those caught beneath its airbursts. That ambiguity is its story, and it is the story of a colonel who was ordered to stand by and watch his men die, and who looked at the rules, looked at his men, and chose his men. If this episode moved you, consider joining the conversation. The file is open. If you were in Mallory's place, knowing the risk to the entire war effort but seeing the faces of your men, what would you do? Write obey or risk in the comments and explain why. Your answers help us understand how these choices look from different lives and inform our next deep dive into the inventions that reshaped our world. And if you value this kind of careful research and stories where engineering and human judgment collide, subscribe to the Apocryphal Archive. Follow us as we continue to examine the untold processes and hidden truths behind our history. Until next time, remember that every piece of technology carries both a promise and a responsibility. File 044 closed.